Good evening. The news gang is here. Tonight, the return of tear gas, running battles, and that sinking feeling. Also on the show, lost and found, the fall and rise of the 2020 academic year. We unmask the road ahead. On the memo tonight, truth or dare, Jamila and the 47 governors. Yvonne's take is an ode to the fallen Murang'a duo and the silly season. On the kicker, what Jubilee has joined together, let no man put asunder. Gashur is punching on the hustlers, fighting hustlers, expecting dynasties to feel the pain. And the angle is on a wing and a prayer.
The convener or any person intending to hold a public meeting or a public procession shall A, notify the officer commanding station, OCS, that is OCS, of such intent at least 3 days, but not more than 14 days before the proposed date of the public meeting or procession.
All right, so Joseph King, you are there. Linus, interesting that these provisions have always been in the Public Order Act, but somehow they found it necessary to invoke them. And we saw that in Nyamira today. I mean, the DP essentially becoming the first casualty of these newly restated provisions in the Public Order Act.
Very ironic events, Joe, because the Public Order Act itself has never been mainstreamed to be aligned with the new Constitution of Kenya 2010, which is where a lot of debate will arise, because this is exactly this position Kenyans were walking away from when the Constitution of Kenya 2010 was promulgated. It came up and it was informed mainly by the activities of the last 30 years before the passing of the Constitution of Kenya 2010. Remember, there was suppression of political gatherings, political opinion, meetings, you know, because the ruling party KANU wanted to dominate the political space. And what it used, and it goes back to history, the history of the colonial governments, was the Public Order Act, also known as the Chief's Act. You know, a chief can disperse a meeting. So you will see that critics of what is going on right now are pointing at the past and saying, here is the past creeping right back. They are citing the Public Order Act again. They are doing what KANU did. They are doing what the colonial administration did. And that is the debate we are going to have going forward. And one strength of the critics is Public Order Act has not been aligned with the Constitution of Kenya 2010.
And it perhaps explains why it is kept very quiet until they actually need to use it. And also quite curious that actually this has not featured in all the conversations we've been having about changing the Constitution, because indeed, if there were things like these ones that are very clearly against the Constitution, there should be perhaps more clear provisions in the very Constitution, or indeed saying that, you know what, someone going to court or whatever, so that this thing can be declared unconstitutional, because any law passed by Parliament or any other subordinate bodies, usually the lawyers would say that it is null and void to the extent of the inconsistency to the Constitution. But quite interesting, Gashuri, that the DP, of all people, plans to have a meeting in Nyamira, and the police go there ahead of him, and the tents are brought down, tear gas is flying, running battles. Very, very unfamiliar, only that the victim in this case is not quite familiar when it comes to these sorts of things. We've seen this kind of thing happen, for example, with Raila Odinga in previous times, and some other opposition politicians. But now this is someone who is actually in government. Like, it doesn't get more dysfunctional than this.
Every so often when we talk about the deputy president being the second in command, occupying the second highest office in the country, yet an outsider in the same government, this is exactly what we meant. And it was a matter of...
Maybe should ask second in commanding what?
Commanding what? Because obviously...
things are going now, yes.
Yeah, because obviously there's no one who has a bigger office other than the president and the deputy, the two of them in the country. So it was only a matter of time before this happened. And as a result of what we saw in Murang'a, and we'll get there, when I heard the National Security Advisory Council, initially we were told National Security Advisory Council was meeting and was going to issue a raft of directives on how to contain public disorder and the wave of violence that we saw in Murang'a. I thought instantly that something of this sort was going to happen. And what is also interesting is that as soon as Joseph Kinyo, head of public service, read this statement, there was no question and answer session. A straight statement read, and they left. And it is also important to look at who were present in that meeting. When every so often you hear the deputy president and his team talk about deep state security, the system, probably we got maybe the first picture of the so-called, at least a part of the so-called system. And that they came and issued these directives tells you something. Because it was a matter of time, it was only a matter of time before measures were put in place to contain the deputy president, to stop him, basically. Because, as we said last Thursday, the hustler narrative is gaining momentum. And you see, every time you talk about those who have and those who don't have, there will always be an interest that is elicited, because the number of poor people in this country is higher, greater than the number of people you would consider who have it. What I also found interesting is that look at the directives, and particularly Part A, that the conveners of any public meeting or a public procession must notify the officer commanding station, OCS, of such intent at least 3 days, but not more than 14 days before the proposed date of the public meeting or procession. Notifying. What does notifying necessarily mean? And is it possible that after the notification, the OCS can say, you won't hold this meeting, or you will hold it?
Of course it has happened. Of course it can. Actually, that same Public Order Act, if you look at Section 5, I think subsection 8, which actually says that this person can, if in the opinion of that officer of the rank of inspector or above, this meeting is likely to lead to a breach of peace or something like that, or lead to violence. I mean, it is discretionary in that manner, that this police officer will say, in my opinion, I have looked at this situation and it looks like some people are going to fight here. I mean, they don't have to prove that anybody will fight. It is actually what that law says. Opinion. That's why actually the problem is not in those things, it's actually in the law itself, because they can actually refer to you and say, you know,
here it is.
Here it is.
And you see, what is also interesting, before I let Yvonne get in, is the opinion. It is the opinion of the OCS. And this OCS is also acting on directions and directives from elsewhere. So his opinion on the ground is not necessarily his opinion. It can also be the opinion of the Ministry of Interior Affairs and Coordination of National Government, or the Inspector General, or the National Intelligence Service. Anybody's opinion above that officer can influence that decision. And also, look at C, obey all orders given to him or her by the OCS or any police officer of or above the rank of inspector. So even a meeting can be going on, can have been allowed, and then the OCS or an inspector of police comes and says, this meeting, from the information we have gathered a few minutes ago, is that it is likely to lead in a breach of peace. So this meeting will not go on, and you are obligated to follow that lawful order. So basically, you can clearly tell where these directives are coming from and what they are aimed at. Now, the question is, what do they do to the campaigns that the deputy president has been going on with? Do they win him some sympathy? Do they attract some feeling of he's being victimized, or so on and so on and so forth? And on the other hand, does it feel, or are there people who will say this is what ought to have been done? So mixed bag, depending on where you stand.
And
on this
there's also the argument, Yvonne, that politically, usually this is also used to lump all manner of things at somebody, because they'll be saying, you know what, if you hadn't gone to that place, if you hadn't planned to go there in the first place, this would not have happened. You know, people would not have been beaten, people would not have been killed.
Property would not have been damaged.
But still quite familiar. I mean, the same script has been used very many times before.
Absolutely, including by those to whom it is being done against right now. I do remember, back in the day, there was statements which were coming from this very side about tuko na tear gas ya kutosha. And so it is instructive to note, wachana na Matiang'i, and it is instructive to note, about laws that are inconsistent with the Constitution, particularly this one with the Bill of Rights, and some of these laws that we put in place for posterity, because you never know the point at which this will be used against you in the future, should you fall afoul of those who hold power. And like we've said, the Public Order Act has been used to infringe upon the rights of freedom of association, freedom of speech, and this has been something that we need to actually take a look at. I don't know if any of you remember some proposed amendments. Was it last year or the year before? Amendments to this Public Order Act to hold protesters personally liable for any damage that takes place, during a protest. And human rights activists were quick to say this is very inconsistent with everything that's happening. The irony of it is also from the dispatch that we got from the cabinet meeting today that set up the multi-agency team on public order with representatives from various public offices, of course the security sector, the ICT regulatory bodies, and the NCIC. And interestingly, that will be chaired by Bwana Matiang'i. Or at least, the security plays, a big role in that. So you can imagine the convener, as it says, who would ideally be the deputy president, seeking permission from the OCS, and all of that could eventually end up, with the cabinet secretary for interior. That is what, for me, is interesting. But then there is another line, because this is very interesting, that this multi-agency team will monitor, document, and enforce compliance over the permitted, among other things, the permitted processes for media broadcasting, publishing and reporting, and the responsible conduct of persons using social media. So now we are getting back to this. Not that we ever left, in my opinion, but again, this is something that is wielded as a big stick to come in and bring down opponents, if you like, bring them down to size. And it's about time that something is done about this, regardless of which side you fall on. Even though these were cheering a couple of years ago when this was being done against their opponents, now they're on the receiving end. It is my hope, that maybe we now start to do something about it.
Speaking about the receiving end, Joe, before we play a clip, I just want to ask one question. Will this be a case of msimeno kukata mbele na nyuma, ama msimeno utakata mbele peke yake? Because will this directive be implemented across board? Everybody who wants to have such political gatherings, doesn't matter the political leanings, will have to adhere to these regulations, 3 to 14 days, and all the others that have been written here? Or will it just be the one side that is seemingly not on the right side of the government? And then, of course, this is all because of the DP and the campaigns he's been doing. How will they stop the meetings that the DP is having at, let's say, in his current home, or the meetings that he's been having in Sugoi, if these directives are to be followed? Because those are his homes, his private residence. So how will that be going forward? But I think for me, before you finish, okay, Joe, I know you want us to play a clip of something that Yvonne said, then we can continue. I'd really like to hear what Mr. Kinyo spoke about social media outlets, then we can continue.
Okay.
That all media outlets shall be held responsible for all the content that they publish, add, or broadcast pursuant to the Section 62 of the National Cohesion and Integration Act, as read together with the guidelines for monitoring hate speech in the electronic media issued by the National Cohesion and Integration Commission. All social media users shall be held individually liable for all content on their social media profile pursuant to the National Cohesion and Integration Act, as read together with the guidelines on prevention of dissemination of undesirable, bulk, and premium rate political messages and political social media content via electronic communication network.
Linus, you were looking at this one, and I think you are just as concerned. I mean, we've seen this many times in the country before, where some archaic laws that are hiding somewhere in the books are weaponized at a time like this, to the detriment of more than just the people that is targeting at that point.
My concern, Joe, is not so much about the social media and even mainstream media, but about a government that sometimes sounds like it's running a kindergarten. That people don't know what is going on. You have this body called the National Security Advisory Committee, which is a departure from what the Constitution provides. Article 240 of the Constitution provides for the establishment of the National Security Council, which consists of the President, the Deputy President, the Cabinet Secretary responsible for defense, CS responsible for foreign affairs, CS responsible for internal security, the Attorney General, the Chief of Defense Forces of Kenya, the DG of National Intelligence, Inspector General of the Police. That is the constitution of the National Security Council. Two things there. One, the head of public service is not a member of the National Security Council as written in the Constitution. So there is this other body that then gives Mr. Joseph Kinyua, a very nice gentleman, the authority to read the statement he did. But these are the things that people would question if this government is challenged in court and told, where are you coming from? The other issue I would like to raise there, Joe, is every Kenyan knows the events of the last 2 weeks. Forget about the last few months. You can just think about the last 2 weeks, actually the last 1 week. There have been events that basically revolved around the presidency, where President Uhuru Kenyatta has faced what must be interpreted correctly as an open challenge from his deputy, William Ruto. At some point, he went to the party headquarters and all that. So, in reaction, and Devon, last week you were calling it divorce proceedings. So, using your analogy, I can tell you that what is happening here is you have a couple that is fighting, but instead of them addressing their issues, they decide to beat up the children. Right. So the husband is not addressing the wife. They're going for the children. They're even going for the neighbors called social media and all that. We are backing up the wrong tree. So here is the dilemma, and Jamila, you raised very, very important questions. Because the dilemma of this government is, it has been faced by a political challenge, whose only response should be political. You can't face a political challenge from William Ruto by responding administratively. I saw you explain earlier today, and you explained that tear gas has absolutely no role in the removal of a deputy president. It has to go through motions, through the Constitution. Article 149, Article 150, to remove the deputy president. So what we are seeing is not sustainable. And they can ask any administration previously that has walked this road. I was a young reporter when, Joe, if you remember the National Constitution, National Executive Constitution Council.
NCC.
NCC.
Yeah.
Or did you remember the name in full?
Yeah, it's the National
Convention Executive Council. Led by, it was co-chaired by Kivutha Kibwana and someone else. This is when the civil society groups proved a serious force in the politics of Kenya. Now, there was their usual administrative response, which is tear gas them, take up the places of gatherings and all that. But President Daniel Arap Moi also had a political response. What did he do? He went to Parliament and noticed very, very clearly that the force of NCC on the ground was not one to ignore. And this was political. So you can only respond politically. So what he did was to go to Parliament and formed a parliamentary committee led by, co-chaired by Raila Odinga and the late George Saitoti, to that then give birth to the IPPG, Interparliamentary Parliamentary Group. And that is the group that then went on to deliver the minimum reforms as demanded by the civil society. So my point here, Joe, is William Ruto's is a political challenge. And if the side that now acts for President Uhuru Kenyatta doesn't respond politically, then they'll have problems, because tear gas is not sustainable, blocking rallies is not sustainable, and actually courts, which will interpret the constitution, will not allow the country to slide back to 1983.
But that's the politics of this.
Just a minute. There's something about power, raw power, and power on the ground, so to say. And there's an element of rebellion every so often when power, government power comes, you know, into contest with people generally. And you remember during the IEBC demos, you remember
Machozi
them?
Mondays.
The Machozi Monday.
Yeah.
It got to a point where after too much tear gas and after too many running battles, something had to be done.
Yeah.
So what basically I suspect will happen, if the deputy president so chooses to go on with his functions, and you know, the people demand that he addresses them and everything else, you will throw tear gas today and tomorrow and the other day, and somewhat people grow immune. But now the question is the keeping power of the supporters of the deputy president. Can they? Will they manage? Will they sustain the demonstrations, the tear gas and everything else? Because what this directive from the National Security Advisory Committee simply means is that political power will be faced with government power, you know? And you saw today in Kebirigo, about 6 truckloads of police officers. Actually, at one point, you could even see like it was almost one person, one policeman. Yeah. You know, that show of might. And I don't know whether that's basically what they call power. You know, when people say we want to get into power, is this the power that you talk about? Power in the sense that police force, the military, the National Intelligence Service, and basically those state security apparatus that are unleashed on you to bring you down, dilute you politically.
When you speak about unleashing police officers, this whole thing, I think, was sort of triggered by what happened in Murang'a over the weekend at Kenol, where 2 people lost their lives, and we'll name them here: 21-year-old Christopher Kariuki and 15-year-old Peter Mbodhu, who died when because of a meeting that was to be addressed by Deputy President William Ruto. Of course, this was attributed to the Tanga and Keleke factions, and these 2 young men were caught in it. We don't know. Their families claim they were there mahali ambapo hawapasa kuwa, wrong place at the wrong time. Like that young man was not even eligible to vote. He was 15 years old. Hata hakuwa na ID, hata angeshughulika, hata angehusika katika uchaguzi unaokuja, because come 2022, he'd still have been old enough to vote. And the 20-year-old Christopher Kariuki, who left, I think, a 5-month-old child. Whatever the reasons may be. I remember I was listening to Peter's sister, and she said he was going somewhere else. Then someone told me there'll be a political meeting and there'll be handouts. So he went there for the handouts. And Christopher's wife says the previous night she told him he had gotten a job and he was going to get 2,000 shillings from the job he was going to. And the last thing she heard was he was in hospital and he had died from stab wounds to the back. This reminds me of how this always happens, and the politicians themselves, who seem to be the cause of this, are neither involved directly. We don't see them running around. We don't see them getting affected as much as these people are, because now these 2 families, whatever happened in Kenol over the weekend has changed their lives forever. I remember Baby Pendo, Joe, paka leo, because I was reading an article that August this year, Baby Pendo would have been 3.5 years old. But the family has never forgotten what happened. And the dad says that he was even unable to continue with his job. He was given so many promises by leaders, but none of them came to pass. He was even they don't move on. And he was told, in fact, he looks for a job and he's told, apana, wewe umepatiwa kazi na county government, which isn't true. He has heard there's a road that's supposed to be named after his daughter. He's heard there's a park that's supposed to be named after his daughter. None of those have happened, but they do not really help him in any way, shape or form. So for me, this just happens to wananchi wa kawaida. Our leaders don't get to feel it at all.
think also, Jamila, what for me I find particularly worrying about this is that usually when something like this happens, it doesn't bode well for the country, because it sets the stage for worse things. Because I remember very well in 2007, in the run-up to that election, there was a lot of this intolerance. There's I think the same William Ruto back then, you remember there was a fight, I think it was in South Mugirango, if I'm not wrong, where he actually left a shoe behind because there were people who came and disrupted the meeting. Raila Odinga was stopped from entering a certain restaurant, I think it was in Karatina someplace, and there were all these things, because once the intolerance starts, people will start saying, oh yeah, this is what you did to a person in this place, then you also don't come here. And when that thing happens, it means it begins to normalize violence, and when the election comes, it is very easy then for people to engage in acts of violence in response to whatever might happen at the ballot. So it really is a very bad sign. I actually think about it with trepidation, knowing what has happened in this country before. But it looks to me...
Joe, here is why it's worse than that as well, because to the incident you are referring to, the lines were clear. It's government and opposition.
Yeah.
So, and somehow there are precedents to that kind of repression before. Here is a very awkward scenario where, have you imagined if Deputy President William Ruto was already in Keberigo today, and 6 truckloads of policemen come and disperse a meeting of the Deputy President.
And he's tear-gassed in the process. You see him running around with a handkerchief.
And he also has his security that would no doubt try to counter, the heavy police presence, because
you can't even tell where they would belong, because there's also a chain of command, and they would recognize their seniors on the ground. I don't know whether they would change positions, tear gas notwithstanding. This is a real dilemma, because we have a government that is fighting itself.
But shouldn't they just resolve it in the sense that if, for example, it is untenable, why can't they call it quits, so we know where people actually belong? Because right now we are in some kind of pretense that we actually have a government, but it is so dysfunctional that you don't understand why the Deputy President and the President would say they are in the same government, because they keep saying, oh, serikali tuliunda, sisi tuko hapo ndani. But where is the courage for someone to say, this is not working for the sake of the country, let's do something about it?
And again, the analogy of divorce proceedings is, this is exactly it. No party is willing to say it's over, but you're both living in that house, as untenable as it is, not seeing eye to eye. I mean, and look at, what we've seen happening between cabinet secretaries and the Deputy President, who in that chain of command, is ideally their boss. The irony of the fact that the Deputy President, being perhaps the convener of a meeting, having to seek, clarification, permission, or give notice to an officer commanding station, and then that possibly being denied by that multi-agency committee.
Then you will go and complain. But he's been complaining publicly about police officers and the government coming to beat innocent people.
And does he complain, for example, ought to be a fly on the wall at today's cabinet meeting? Is that something that he would bring up at the cabinet meeting and say, Mr. President, when I was at function X, the police were heavy-handed? I mean, this is absolutely dysfunctional. And
but was there in the cabinet meeting?
He was present.
But he tweeted after that.
He did.
Story about
but you see, this is the thing I wonder, is whether those tweets and what he did say, on Twitter, would be something that he would be able to say at the cabinet meeting. And let us face it, whatever is happening in the party is now spilling over and becoming a national crisis. And this is something that the deputy party leader and the party leader of the majority party can sit down, sort out, agree to go their separate ways if that is what they want to do, and let the country be and let it run, because it's obvious that it's affecting national governance.
Unfortunately, that will not happen for the time being, Yvonne, and this is the reason. You see, everybody feels they have invested in this government. Okay. The president feels so, the deputy president feels so. And obviously, there's something about being in government. Even though you're an outsider, you're considered an outsider, there's some certain things that you get while in government that you don't get while outside government. And so I would look at it this way. The deputy president will keep in that government until such a time that he feels now this is the right time to exit. And you see, the trick is, unlike past dispensations, constitutionally, the president can't fire his deputy. They are joined at the hip, no matter how much they quarrel, unless one says, I've had enough, let me quit. There's nothing that is going to happen.
Or is impeached.
Or is impeached. But you see also, when you look at the numbers in Parliament, you need 2/3 in the National Assembly and 2/3 in the Senate. So it is not possible to get 233 members, at least for the time being, unless with immense mobilization to impeach the deputy president, or even impeach the president if need be.
Okay.
So that is the challenge in it. But more importantly, this kind of quarrel is not a good thing for the country. And this is why I think it's not a good thing for the country. You see, the president and his deputy are the first full implementers of this constitution. They're actually the first case study of a pure presidential system in our country. So future presidential candidates will have very many things to look up to what the president and his deputy currently have done or have not done, especially in terms of their relationship. And you see, truth be told, it is not possible for one region or one area to successfully compete for a presidential election and win. And even if that was the case, no matter how many numbers you have, the Constitution requires you to have 25% of the votes cast in at least 24 counties. So ultimately, as a presidential candidate, you must go out there and seek alliances. Lastly, there's a soundbite when the deputy president met a delegation from, I think, Kajiado, Narok, and he was talking about the use of state security to intimidate him or to undermine him.
I think
and he spoke about two things: police and the wave of, his rallies or functions being disrupted. Take a listen.
And I want to ask the Inspector General of Police not to accept to participate in political assignments that are given by people who do not have the constitutional authority to assign the police any responsibility or any duties. The police must be independent.
What basically the deputy president is saying is that police have taken sides. That is his interpretation of it. And when he says that they should not take instructions from people who are not supposed to give them instructions, he's basically pointing at the the Interior Affairs and Coordination of National Government Ministry. Because every so often, he has said that is where his problems lie. He says, without many things, he has often talked about the CS there and the interior and the PS there. Basically, you can tell where he's heading.
But isn't that a cop-out, quite frankly? I mean, look, these people are supposed to be his juniors in government.
Precisely.
And therefore, it is really, where I come from, they say that if someone who's stronger than you steps on your mother's smoking pipe, then you tell me, sasa we mama uliweka hiyo kitu hapo ya nini?
Uliweka vibaya.
Wewe unawekanga hii kitu vizuri, kwa nini unaweka vibaya? Because I think really the problem that the deputy president has, he needs to deal with the president, because the president can say something to, if it is Dr. Matiang'i or PS Kibisho or whatever. If the president says wachana na, the way he used to say wachana na Matiang'i, if the president says wachana na Dr. Ruto, atachana na yeye. So there's a problem here, and for me the bottom line is as follows. One is that at the end of the day, these people went to Kenyans, the two of them, as Jubilee, and they promised certain things, which things now nobody is talking about. And there's no way either one of them can run away and say, you know what, this is, the government is doing whatever. So both the deputy president and the president are joined at the hip, and they need to face Kenyans and deal with the things that they promised Kenyans they would do. Because as it is now, whether it was stadiums or laptops
or 1 million
jobs or Big Four agenda, all of these things, Kenyans are going to remember that it is the two of them. Because they were two of them, they used to campaign together, they promised Kenyans all of these things.
The question that should not be lost, Joe, is what is the bone of contention? Why are we here? We are here because of egos, mere sheer egos. between the president and his deputy. Because historically we've had differences between presidents and their deputies. Or in the old good days we called them vice presidents. And in 1966, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga parted ways with Jomo Kenyatta on policy issues, very, very clear policy issues. The argument of Jaramogi Oginga Odinga and that of Bildad Kagia was that KANU was not living to its promise of African socialism and was becoming as capitalist, if not worse, than the colonial administration it had replaced. Now, those were issues of principle. If Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto are put in a room and asked, what are your policy differences? What will they tell Kenyans? There are absolutely no policy differences, zero policy differences. They are all fighting about exercise of political power. I think, and we explained it here repeatedly, that there has been the issue of early campaigns on the part of the deputy president. And there is also the grievance of lack of leadership on the part of the president when it comes to the affairs of Jubilee, the party that is governing the country. And this must really be pointed out also as a style of the President Uhuru Kenyatta compared to his previous predecessors. Well, he comes close to Mwai Kibaki because Mwai Kibaki never really concentrated on running parties.
Did he have any?
Actually, at some point, he was partyless. And remember, heading to the election, in his re-election, he had no party.
He couldn't even
he couldn't pronounce PNU because there was
the Punu.
It was PNU and GNU.
I remember that.
I think GNU was shelved because of the Masai Mara wildebeest equivalent. So they went for PNU, which sounded much better. But the post-2013 scenario is one that the party really matters. And if you go back and remember the grievances of the Central Kenya members of parliament, they always said, the boss doesn't meet us, he doesn't talk to us. Because the party is an engine, it has to be fueled. And I don't mean financially like they do, but with ideas and activity, elections and things like that. And the president has never shown his hand on that. Lately, we've seen some activity with the deputy, is it the vice chairman and the secretary general at Jubilee headquarters? But basically, that is where the bulk of the grievance in Jubilee comes from, the inactivity of the president on the party front. On the deputy president's side, it's basically ambitions that's running too early. He's been running for 2022 from 2013 to 2017, 2020. I mean, if you look at us, Tanzania is holding elections on the 28th of October. But the US is holding on the 3rd of November.
But you wouldn't.
It looks to me like we are holding our elections on Monday.
Next week. I think Joe, as we take a break, last thing, Joe. This is, as in a summary of what we've all said, the ruling house is in a mess. And because of that, it is affecting government functionality as we see it. And it is affecting the political mood in the country. And it's baffling that this is happening when we are going through the COVID-19 pandemic. It's baffling we're going through this when livelihoods have been lost. It's baffling that we're going through this. Hata kama tungekuwa tuko na COVID, ingekuwa tu wakati wa kawaida, it would still be baffling. Because as we talk about this being October 2020, na uchaguzi ni August 2022, it is baffling to me that we're not planning on what next after COVID-19, that we have everything has been affected. Our newspaper headlines are just about politics, conversations, barazani, kijiweni, kando ya barabara, social media is about politics. Tumesahau kila kitu, forgetting that politics will not feed us.
All right. On that note, we take a break here on News Gang. When we come back, we'll actually talk about the reopening of schools, reopening of other things, and what really that means for the next couple of days.